The rocks on top of Mount Diablo, the oldest rocks on the mountain, are called Franciscan rocks. And the first one to really study them, the rocks that were noticed by the California Geologic Survey, the ones that troubled William Brewer, that looked like they'd been roasted by the devil, the first one to really study those was a professor from UC Berkeley, who wasn't much for personality. He must have gone to the Josiah Whitney Finishing School, but at least in his early days, he was quite the geologist. His name was Andrew Lawson. He was born in Scotland and became a professor at UC Berkeley in about 1890. And he was on the faculty a long time, right until 1952, as a professor emeritus. So on the Berkeley campus for 60 years, and for most of those 60 years, he was the most honorary guy in the geology department. But in his early days, when he still was somewhat approachable, he was sitting in his classroom lecturing his students. Most geology was done indoors by that time. And he looked out the window, and the sun was shining. And he turned to his class and said, "It's a nice day outside. Let's do our geology outdoors." And that was the birth of field geology at UC Berkeley. Well, his first geology field class traveled all over the Bay Area, including Mount Diablo. His wife was once asked what her famous geologist's husband, what his religion was. And she looked at the reporter and said, "He's a geologist." But anyway, Lawson traveled with his field class. He traveled to the Marin Headlands and to the Twin Peaks area in San Francisco and over to Mount Diablo. And he found the same rocks in all three places. It kind of puzzled him. He could identify the rocks, but he really couldn't interpret them. He found rocks that looked like they had been erupted from undersea volcanoes. He found rocks that he knew must have been deposited on the ocean floor. They were high in silica. They had either been from the microscopic skeletons of prehistoric sea creatures or from volcanic activity. And he found a sandstone that looked like it had been created from underwater landslides. And he scratched his head, and he tried, but he really couldn't come up with a satisfactory explanation of why these three rocks would be found together in these three different places. He never did quite figure them out, because there's a geologic theory that we take for granted now, but wasn't available to him back then. And of course, that's plate tectonics. There was the theory of continental drift, which was the great grandpa and grandma of plate tectonics. That was developed in 1915. Unfortunately, it wasn't a geologist that did it. It was a meteorologist, and he was German. So he was looked at askance. And although he was sure those continents must be moving around, his name was Alfred Wegener, he had no mechanism to prove it. One of Lawson's grad students in the 1930s went to Professor Lawson and said, "We've got this theory of how these continents could be moving around, and there's a new idea that maybe it's convection currents in the mantle, that maybe I could do some research on this." And Lawson gave him his skank eye stare, and he says, "Well, I might be gullible, but I'm not gullible enough to swallow that poppycock." And that was the end of that. By 1904, Lawson had become one of the most prominent geologists in the country, and we all know of the San Francisco earthquake in April 1906. Well, San Francisco and Northern California started having tremors in December of 1904, and they were severe enough that people got upset, and they ran over to UC Berkeley and they asked Professor Lawson if there was anything to worry about. And he said, "Oh no, those are just harmless tremors. We seldom have big earthquakes in California." And after the huge earthquake that Professor Lawson said we didn't have to worry about, they went back to Professor Lawson and they made him head of the committee to study that earthquake. Well, he somewhat atoned for his previous actions. He was the one that mapped that harmless rift, as he had called it, the San Andreas Fault. He named it, and he did a great job in mapping the entire length of that fault. And it's still available, at least in geologic libraries. But at the end, there's one question that was raised that remained a mystery that Professor Lawson just could not answer, because when he got to Point Reyes, it was obvious that the land had shifted 25 feet laterally, at least. And back then, well, all geology was local. The land could move up and down vertically, but it didn't move horizontally. Well, he would have had to embrace plate tectonics for that to make any sense, and he just couldn't do it. So that was the big unanswered question of the Lawson report. Why that ground at Point Reyes shifted all that way laterally. Well, we've all heard about the poor Bay Bridge cost overruns and the $6 billion bridge. The Golden Gate Bridge, it had its own problems. That bridge was difficult to build, not only because of where it is, but because of the rock it had to be built in. The main construction occurred in 1936, 1937, and you can guess who the geologic advisor for the bridge was. Andrew Lawson. Well, they had to build it right at the narrow point there. That's where it had to go, because it's about a mile across. That was the easiest spot, because there are terrific currents there. And the Marin side was really no problem, because it's anchored in pillow basalt and chert, which are very hard rocks. But the South Tower and over at Fort Point, there was a problem, because the rock there is our state rock, serpentinite, which is usually the last rock you ever want to build in. It's a red flag indicator of an earthquake fault, and it's soft and crumbly. But they didn't have a choice. That's where the bridge had to go. And Lawson said, I found a good spot for you. Dig your hole there. Anyway, so it's 1936. They've got the North Tower up. They've got the hole dug 107 feet into the strait there, ready to pour the concrete, when up from Stanford University comes a man named Bailey Willis, who was the head of the geology department there, and he was Professor Lawson's big rival. So Bailey Willis wasn't going to let this opportunity to go by. He took one look at the hole, he took a look at the serpentine, and he said, you can't build a bridge in serpentine. It's going to fall down. Everybody knows that. Well, that got the bridge district all upset. They had Professor Lawson come in from Berkeley on a ferry boat. They got a giant crane. They put a bucket at the end of the crane. They told Professor Lawson to sit in the bucket, and they lowered him down 107 feet into that hole. When he got out at the bottom of the hole, took out his rock hammer, tapped on the side of the excavation, and looked up and cupped his hands and said, this rings like steel, pour the concrete, which they did. They got him out first. And all these years later, the bridge is still standing. So that was one big game that Cal won. And it turned out Lawson really had found a good spot to put the excavation, some solid serpentinite, and that Bailey Willis was looking at an old map. Professor Lawson became more opinionated as time went by. We got some very famous geologists today complaining about what misery it was being in one of his seminars, how closed-minded and difficult he was, but no one had it worse than the women in his class. He'd start every lecture the same way. He'd walk out into the big lecture hall and he'd say, good day, gentlemen. And he would never acknowledge any of the women. He'd never call on them. Well, he wasn't very popular among the male students either, and one day they decided to play a trick on him. It must have been April Fool's Day. All the males decided to stay out of the class, so it would just be the females in there. So here it is. Professor Lawson walks out into the big lecture hall at UC Berkeley, head down, gets to the podium, spreads out his notes, and finally looks up for the first time. And he just sees the women out there. No males. And for a few seconds he's speechless. And then he looks down, he gathers up his notes, looks up again, and he announces, well, see, nobody's here today, lecture's canceled.